Good afternoon, everybody. We are going to get started knowing that people will be joining us along the way. I just want to welcome everyone to the premiere episode of our Bill of Rights for Criminalized Workers webinar series. You may notice that my name under my picture is David Etheridge Bartow. That is only because I'm technologically deficient and our graphics person set this webinar up. My name is Megan French Marcelin, and I'm the coordinator of Just Leadership USA's Working Future campaign. And this campaign is grounded in a powerful, if not straightforward, premise that systems of oppression are durable. And if we are to dismantle them, we must not just expose their current manifestation, but demand that our work consistently target the deeper structural inequalities that are entrenched in our society and that fuel these systems. With this first webinar, what I hope that this webinar is the first of many conversations about how we actually do that, how we begin to dismantle those deeper systems. Today, we're going to hear from our esteemed panel, led and moderated by Dr. Devine Pryor, and then we'll have some time for question and answer. When it's time for that, please write your questions in the comment box and they will be fed to us. But first, I would like to just take a moment to turn it over to Just Leadership's President and CEO, Deanna Hoskins, who's going to tell you a little bit about how this webinar series evolved and where we see it going with the organization. Thank you, Deanna.
Thank you, Megan. Hello, everyone. As Megan said, I'm Deanna Hoskins, President, CEO of Just Leadership USA. I want to welcome you to our webinar on the right to human dignity and people first language. This is the first of 10 webinars dedicated to our Working Future campaign's Bill of Rights for Criminalized Workers. For the 70 million people living with a criminal record in the US, the penalties of a conviction last far beyond a sentence, and the over 48,000 laws and barriers we face amount to a perpetual second-class status. The Working Future campaign is committed to eliminating the devastating barriers to health, housing, and work while restoring basic human dignity to all. You can find out more about our campaign at justleadershipusa.org. Our Bill of Rights centers on human rights, and it's about what we want. We hope you see the Bill of Rights as aspirational, a way to begin a discussion about what a true working future looks like. In lockstep with organizational principles, the Bill of Rights platform was written by formerly incarcerated advocates working across the country to reduce those barriers to employment, education, housing, and healthcare. We are excited to partner with so many leading organizations in our movement to bring you this webinar series. For those of us leading this work from a place of lived experience, we are committed to ending the lifelong punishment and stigma of a conviction. It is now my pleasure to introduce our esteemed moderator, Dr. Devine Pryor, Executive Director of the Center for New Leadership on Urban Solutions.
Thank you, Deanna.
Yes, thank you so much. I appreciate your opening remarks and welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'm excited and honored to be a part of this and thank you so much for extending the invitation.
Devine, maybe before we get started, you can give a little bit of the history you shared with us last week about where the fight for human first language came from and how it has developed as a central tenet of the movement for liberation.
Sure. I'd be happy to. So without going into extensive of a history, I'll just say that everyone is quite aware of the stigma that's attached to people with criminal records and how harsh that stigma can be in terms of creating barriers for individuals to reunite with themselves and with their families and with their communities over and beyond all the additional barriers that accompany that. Because the stigma really has so many implications in terms of undermining an individual's right to citizenship and right to being a human being and the right to be treated with courtesy and the right to be treated with respect. The whole idea around the stigma is that this person is an outcast and that they're undeserving and they therefore should not be afforded the same basic dignities and respects as other human beings. So this stigma that's attached to individuals with criminal records has been so severe that it has crippled the very psychology of individuals who come out of the institutions all across the country and the world and attempt to try to regain a sense of dignity and pride and reunite with their families and earn a living and access housing and health care. The stigma prevents them from doing so because what it has done to them emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually. And so we understood that before we could do anything about transforming the criminal justice system, changing policy, we had to first address this issue of stigma. We had to get individuals first to see themselves differently and then to encourage others to do so. And so we understood that it was about the language that was used to describe people who were in prison. And at that time, there was no such thing as a formerly incarcerated person back in the 90s. There was only ex-offenders, ex-cons, ex-inmates, ex-prisoners, every explicitory term that degraded and dehumanized individuals. And after being exposed to a lot of the literature from the various movements, the civil rights movements, the suffrage movement, even the movement that started in the bathhouses in San Francisco amongst the gay community when they were hit with the whole issue of HIV and AIDS, all of those groups understood that they needed to use language to define pathways for independence and to define who they were from the perspective that they defined and that was imposed upon them. And so all of those movements informed our strategy to begin to encourage our peers and our colleagues to use more humanizing language to describe who and what we are as a people. And we began simply by asking our friends and colleagues, issuing a language letter, and then more forcefully interrupting seminars and workshops and panels and conferences and sort of demanding that people see us in a particular way, treat us in a certain way, but certainly use language to define us in a human way so that we can be restored back to the level of humanity that we deserve. And so this language campaign has been going on for almost 2 decades now. We've made a lot of headway, and I think that all of us can be proud because it really took the collective work of individuals and organizations all across the country to kind of buy in to the idea that we had to take this upon ourselves to define who we were, what we were, and how we would be treated. And so the language was very helpful in that, and we were happy to make that contribution to the movement. Thank you so much, though, Megan, for allowing me to speak those few moments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Devine. I know that you and the late Eddie Ellis were part of what has really become a movement in terms of language and dignity.
Yes, well, thank you. Now, Megan, I have to ask you if you could allow someone else to moderate the panel because I'm in a situation now that I don't know how long I'm going to be able to stand here, and I cannot moderate from where I'm standing because it would be too difficult. So I just want to ask that small favor of you. And sure. I'll stay on as long as I can.
Sure, of course. And we very much appreciate that history, as it is a history that is critical to where we are today in the movement. But we also know that we have a long way to go.
Yes.
So thank you, and I hope you do stick around. So let me start with something that is just a very basic question, and I throw this out to all of you all, which is that I'm wondering, all of you come from the work to the work from very different places, different backgrounds. what is the importance of language in the way that movements function, whether we're talking about what I believe truly to be the first, this is the modern day civil rights movement, that movement to end mass incarceration. But what is the role of language in movements? And maybe Lily, woman to woman, let's start with you.
Hi. Again, thank you for giving me the platform. And language, when we talk about language earlier, we were talking about terms like felons and convicts and things like that, and the connotations that those terms have brought and how that has shifted. But one thing that we don't necessarily talk about when discussing language is also the language of like value, right? And how we apply value to certain experiences. In particular, whether that be your being formally incarcerated, and how personhood is restored with how you contribute. So when talking about terminology, aside from looking at words like felon and formerly incarcerated and using people first language, it's also looking at like how we engage in these conversations and the language that we use when having them.
Thank you. And what I realized I did not do was introduce our panel, which is a horrific oversight on my part. Lily Gonzalez is former Leading with Conviction fellow, current, actually I can't remember what your current fellowship is.
I'm currently on my campus, the Newman Civic Fellow, which means that I represent my school nationally for the civic work that we've been doing on campus.
Thank you. And I'm gonna turn that question over to you, Quentin, to just for the same sort of thing. How do we begin to think about the use of language in movements, whether it's language that is used to oppress movements or to strengthen them? And maybe you can give you a quick introduction of yourself, since I've already messed that part up.
It's okay. As you stated, again, thank you for having me on this panel with these wonderful folks. My name is Quentin Williams. I am a project manager at Heartland Alliance, a human rights organization here in Chicago. I'm also a part-time instructor and PhD student at Loyola University, and also a Leading with Conviction alumni 2018. So with regard to the question of language, I think when I think about language and movements, I think about, because as has been stated by Dr. Pryor, I think language has a long history of abuse and used as a weapon against marginalized groups. And I think as it relates to people who have been criminalized or formerly incarcerated folks, I think it's so important that we use people first language, because there is a constant assault on the dignity of people who have records by way of language. In fact, just recently, it was, a couple of above the fold articles that came out recently, and they use that kind of language because language is powerful and it shapes perception. So I think movements that use people first language is important, it's an important counter to language that is shaping perceptions in a negative way. And this way, what we want to do is shape perceptions in a positive way, not only positive, a true way, because many of those negative connotations and negative language use, it's not even true about people, marginalized groups, and people with records are no exception to that.
Thanks, Quentin. And finally, I just want, for a very different perspective, to turn it over to Lester. Lester, again, just give us a quick rundown of your role here. And I want you to sort of think about language in the South and some of the conversations I've borne witness to as people adopt language that is humanizing within the work that we're doing around Ban the Box and other employment campaigns in South Carolina.
Hear me?
Yes.
As you mentioned, my name is Lester Young. I'm the statewide organizer for Just Leadership here in South Carolina, and our goals and objectives with this campaign is a Working Future campaign, and we're really focusing on Ban the Box here in South Carolina, which we would think that South Carolina should be a little ahead, but if you understand the history of South Carolina, we know and understand that South Carolina is definitely one of those states that is like 20 years behind in most situations, especially being that we're talking, especially when it comes down to the language movement. The First People's Language movement is something that is extremely important for us here in South Carolina to get to be able to come up to speed, so to speak, with everyone else. As I said, as I see it across the country, the language has always been important in the movement. But South Carolina, when we're talking about formerly incarcerated people movement, Ban the Box issues, Working Future issues, anything related to re-entry issues, South Carolina is not up to speed. So the language is definitely not there as well. So I find myself in rooms constantly focusing on just helping them understand the value and the importance of the language here in South Carolina. So I just wanted to say I really appreciate this opportunity to be on this panel, but most importantly to be a student, to be able to learn and see how I can continue to apply this language in all the different sectors of space that I'm placed in. Thank you.
Thanks, Lester. And I want to throw this back out to the group. And this comes from the conversation we had last week. And Devine, maybe you can give some sort of historical context, because it was interesting to hear you talk about the evolution and the tensions within shifting language. But where I want to start is this idea of returning citizen. And in our current moment, in the era that we do not mention, the issue of and in this particular moment of the government shutdown, the issue of immigration is at the fore of everything that we should be talking about. And yet one of the terms that has surfaced in the last decade is returning citizen, which I think had some very critical connotations when it was first introduced. And so I'm interested to get a sense, just how do we engage terms that don't apply to everybody that's affected by mass criminalization? And that's not just in light of the issues of immigration, but also in light of what we see as the basic civic rights of citizenship, which extend far beyond voting disenfranchisement, but also the ability to serve on juries, the capacity to run for office, et cetera. And I want to think about, as language is developing, how do we deal with the fact that there are always exclusions, or there are always tensions within the language that we use? And Devine, maybe you can kick that off if you're still on, and then folks can weigh in as they see fit. He may have dropped off. Lily, can I start with you again?
Yes. Hi. So the very easy answer would be returning citizen. Like, there's people that are incarcerated and in detention centers that don't hold citizenship. So that's the easy answer. But also, like, let's think critically, like, what does citizenship mean, right? What is that? Questioning that, like, what is that mechanism? And really, it's about inclusion and exclusion. And I think also, like, when talking about how folks want to be identified, is asking folks how they want to be identified, one. But when we engage with this concept of what a returning citizen is, or using that term, it's looking at how not everyone holds that. And then also, like, what is citizenship used to do? Like, what is the purpose of it? Like, thinking more critically about it.
And what is it used to do?
I mean, in my perspective, I see citizenship as an apparatus of maintaining order. It's about inclusion and exclusion. It's about the haves and the have-nots, who gets protection, who doesn't, and also understanding that all of our freedoms are connected to somebody's unfreedom. And looking at that in a broader scope and seeing, like, what all these mechanisms are, and what citizenship promises. It's aspirational, right? It's like this whole, like, American dream thing, and how that is used to also, like, maintain a social order.
Yeah. Quentin, want to jump in?
Yeah, I think the term returning citizen, it was, you know, I think the goal of the term obviously was, there's this acknowledgement that folks who have had contact with the criminal legal system, you know, you lose aspects of citizenship, right? That, as Lily said, that are aspirational, so to speak, right? Like, citizenship, what does it mean? It means these aspirational things. It means this inclusion into a broader community. And there's an acknowledgement that people with records, you know, were excluded from the larger community. And that term, it was meant to try to invoke, you know, a reconnection to that. However, I think it's also true that, you know, using that term and using citizenship is a tricky one, and it is a tension because, as Lily stated, there are some people that have been criminalized in the same ways that don't hold formal citizenship here in this country, and we need to be inclusive of them as well, because again, there, as she said so eloquently, I totally agree that our freedoms are connected with other folks' unfreedoms, and I think this is an opportunity for us, right? We've used that word and we had good intentions, but good intentions are different than sort of actual justice, honestly. So if we want to do actual justice, then we have to look at a term that meant for good, but really reevaluate it based off of the broader freedom goals that we have for everybody.
Thanks, Quentin. And I think that's absolutely right. Is in my opening remarks, I talked about the manifestations of oppression and then the deeper structural inequality that we have to fight, citizenship being one of them, if we're truly looking to create a world that has multiple forms of justness, not justice, justness. And it's too bad Devine dropped off, because one of the interesting things he said in our conversation last week was he talked some about what it meant to move from inmate to prisoner, and the importance of prisoner at a certain political moment for folks identifying themselves as prisoners of the state or prisoners of the nation, and what that meant to be politicize that notion, politicize the idea that that mass criminalization is a broader process of keeping people in a perpetual second-class citizenship. And so we've moved beyond that, and in many ways I've seen I think, Lester, you were in the room to witness a warden get called out for using the term inmate and prisoner before. But I wonder, and this I'm going to pitch to all of you, because it's a question of how do we then move beyond that language? Where do we look to for new language in a moment where we are beginning to identify some of the pitfalls of language that has helped us create a certain kind of identity.
Well, I also think that language is also evolving, right? And I think being able to engage in those conversations and listen to the different perspectives also informs what those definitions come to be or what our connotations of those are. So that's one thing, understanding that it is evolving. And the second is seeing, I think, also like how we are in relation to each other instead of like focusing on each other's otherness. And when thinking of even like how we were saying the term citizen, when we're talking about including folks, there's also an exclusion that comes connected to that. So why do we even need to use the term citizen? Like, what does that mean? Is it to other, you know? So understanding that, you know, like I mentioned earlier about the term and how definitions are also evolving, and asking folks like how they choose to identify. And knowing that, you know, a prisoner for somebody may mean one thing and a prisoner for another person may mean a different thing, based also on their experiences.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think one of the things that where we can go, Megan, like where we can look to for new language or ever evolving language to make sure that we're always paying attention to. I think, you know, it's quite simple. Like, people should be always asking directly impacted folks, you know, how they would like to be addressed. I think one of the biggest issues that we've dealt with as directly impacted folks in this movement, and some have been around longer than others, but there's always a tendency lurking around somewhere for folks to define what things mean for folks who are directly impacted. And I think the more that we lean into the reality that we get the best results and we get the best policies, and we also are really making an impact by talking to people who've been directly impacted, talking to people who have actually experienced dehumanizing language, talking to people who have actually been in chains, right? So you're right, like the word prisoner may invoke sometimes. I think sometimes it's appropriate to call attention to the shackles that people hold, right? Because we also don't want to forget that as well. So I think sometimes in some moments, in some contexts, the idea of prisoner can evoke the right sentiment to go forward in the ways that we would like to go forward. So I think it really just starts with people not defining things for, but defining things with, or even allowing folks who are directly impacted to define how they would like to be addressed.
Lester, you have an interesting sort of perspective on this because of the amount of time you spend going back into prisons and engaging folks around language while folks are inside. And I'd just like to hear your thoughts about sort of how language shapes perspective within prison systems.
Running at me. Yeah, I think from just me going back and forth inside of the prison system, language do play a very key role. And most of the individuals that I speak to inside there, they want to just be recognized as a human being. They want to be known as a human being. They want to be recognized as a person versus an inmate or a prisoner. You know, so I think that language, a human finding some way to find a definition or wording to describe them while they're incarcerated, I think is important. But just saying that they're inmates or prisoners, we have to move beyond that. Some guys in there, I noticed, they see themselves as political prisoners. So they like that term prisoner because it adds more of a, you know, because they see themselves as part of the enemy of the state or just individual revolutionaries inside of that system. And they want to be recognized as prisoners, political prisoners, and nothing less, nothing more than that. So that's one of the things that I see that is taking place inside of some of the prisons I attend or visit.
Thanks. And Lily, I'm gonna direct this question to you, but I know that all of you have had experiences with family and with children. You just told a really beautiful story last week about your daughter. Language is something that can harm or heal, and we know that language teaches children about their place in the world, whether it's a lesson in pride or a lesson in shame. And it is something that gets invoked on the playground. It gets invoked on the school bus. It gets invoked as children become young adults, become adults, and are beginning to define themselves. And so I just want you to talk about what that family experience is with language and how that has defined you and your family.
Well, it has shown up like a couple of different ways, right? With one, it was obviously with my daughter, destigmatizing her experience of having two incarcerated parents and what that translated to her academically, and how the response was with her on her campus, and how through having dialogue with her, she's also been able to understand and alleviate some of the stigmatizing that comes connected with that, even at her school, and little things like using the word criminal or felon, or how that comes up in our family, right? And just correcting and saying like, hey, this is why, I use this word and this is why, or like, why are you using that term? Or with my son, when it was the holidays and he was circling the mailers with all the toys, and him circling a Lego jail, like why do you want the jail? So not just destigmatizing the experiences of incarceration and what that means to her. A lot of therapy obviously helps, but in addition to that, how do I talk to my 7-year-old son who wants this Lego jail, right? And talking to him about, well, why does he want it? He's like, well, it catches the bad guys. Well, who's the bad guy? Bad guys go to jail. Well, mommy was in jail. Do you think mommy's a bad guy? And kind of talking to him about that, and even what playing cops and robbers means, right? And things like that, or the bad guy. Just having conversations with him about that has also not only to get them thinking, but also destigmatizes that experience and gets them looking at broader issues, which is what I hope.
Yeah. Quentin, do you want to speak to that at all?
Yeah, I can just make a brief comment about that. I think it's interesting, the family dynamic, because especially the folks that haven't experienced incarceration, because prison and jails are so secluded, right? Like they're on an island. Like most people, they don't know what's going on in there besides what is shown on TV or from anecdotal things, right? So it's really hard for people to, even family, to understand what the proper language is. And but I do think it's like the perfect tension, because as Lily, like asking your son that question is very powerful for him, I think, because it says, well, do you think mommy's a bad guy? Because your family, most times they love you, right? So they know you've been in this place, and they love you, right? And it's like they have to then do the work to like, and you have to work with them, and we have to do this work where we have to reconcile this idea of a quote bad guy or bad woman with this idea of prison, this idea that that's where all the bad people are. Like there has to be some reconciliation there, especially with family, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and then just to add to that, and even when I was having that dialogue with him, it's like, well, what is a bad guy, and talking about that. And when he was like, well, robbers. And I'm like, well, why are people robbing? Let's talk about like the conditions in our community. And he's 6. So we'll see.
It's
That's some
amazing how
intense
much.
training for this for that guy, man. He's in the good. He's in the good house.
What are you talking about? I got that training starting just as early.
That's awesome.
And honestly, I think it's critical. It's critical training that we get, where we begin to shift language from a place of stigmatization to one that focuses on the structural realities we face day to day that are devastating communities through disinvestment, through over-policing, through the brutalization of Black and brown bodies. We need to be having those conversations, and those conversations need to take the place of conversations that stigmatize. So thank you, Lily, for sharing that story. I'm gonna slightly pivot now, and that's because the other part of this conversation we're having today is about the notion of human dignity. And certainly language is at the center of that, but that is a much larger concept. And, you know, our president, Deanna, went on a trip to Germany, I believe, to look at their prison system there. And one of the things that she came back saying, and I'm an abolitionist, but I think this notion applies in any advocacy sense we're thinking, is why are we talking about the restoration of rights when people shouldn't be losing their rights to begin with? And so when we think about the concept of human dignity, how does the insertion of that notion that human dignity should be at the center of all of this, shape and reshape the way that we approach policy and systems transformation? And Quentin, just because I know this is something that you've spent a lot of time on, I'd like you to set us off.
Yep, thank you, no problem. And I apologize that my internet connection is acting a little funky right now, but it looks like it's good now. So I think it's something that's so important to me because one, that, you know, the dignity of people with records, it's just an assault all the way from the time you have an encounter with the police all the way until the denied application at an employer or housing. I mean, from start to finish, there's just an assault on dignity. And I think as it relates to movements and policy, I think what dignity does, and the emphasis on dignity and human rights, a while ago from my office, the Research and Policy Office, we wrote, there was a paper written by one of my colleagues called Utilizing the Human Rights Framework, and how do you use the human rights framework in different contexts? What should you do, right? And one of the most powerful things out of that paper came that this idea that a focus on dignity gets us away from charity and deservedness, right, into another place, right? So I think oftentimes in policy, and I've been in front of legislators, I've been at these tables where, you know, we can talk about, quote, reform, but then the conversation, like, and what we need to do for those people with records, but then it always ends up in this conversation, well, who deserves that, right? Like, do so-called violent offenders deserve that? Do folks with sex, like, who deserves that? But I think an emphasis on dignity, like, really gets away from that, because if you're talking about a human is a human regardless of what context they find themselves in. So I think it moves us away from deservingness. And I think too many of our policies, and we let our elected officials dictate to us who deserves what, right? We deal with this every legislative session. They're saying this group within this group doesn't deserve this, or they exceptionalize us, right? They'll take myself or Lester or Lily and say, hey, look at them, they have done great. And, you know, but it's reframing it and bringing it back to human dignity and human rights, because it gets away from this deservedness and charity frame into a more just frame.
And to add to that, I completely agree that human rights does tend to be limiting. And even when talking about like dignity, and we get caught up in that whole personhood and humanity, some of us haven't even been seen whole before we even entered the system, to be completely honest, because of where we live or because of how we look, or for whatever reason, we were already criminalized. So that's one point. And then the other thing is, like, when thinking about like how we engage in this work, I understand that like not all folks are ready to say that they are abolitionists, but Ruthie Gilmore makes the point when she talks about like non-reformist reform, and what does that mean? And that means that reform that does not extend the life or the scope of the prison industrial complex, right? And then when we have these conversations looking at the whole deserving and non-deserving, which goes back to the citizenship, good immigrant, bad immigrant, we see the same thing in our movement as well, with the violent and non-violent offenders creating that divide, but instead of like seeing it as a whole, right?
Yeah. And maybe, I mean, I think we had a really interesting discussion last week, sort of touching on just the ways in which, and Quentin, I liked how you said it, how policymakers, and I just stop and recognize that just about everybody on this panel, and certainly many of the people on this call, have been in the space of informing and shaping policy. And yet, because of that divisiveness, are not seen as the policymakers that should be at the table making those decisions. And so thinking about that question, whether it be citizen, non-citizen, violent or non-violent, I just wonder what it would mean. And God, I haven't read Ruthie Gilmore in a long time, but now I'm going to go back and read her. What it would mean to take on a different framework of systems transformation that sort of put forth a politics that did not center polarized identities. What would that look like? What does that mean? And how does that reshape our movement? If we are calling this a movement, how does the sort of recentering of things that are not polarizing reshape that?
Well, go ahead, Lily. Did you have something? So I think that one of the things that it'll change, I mean, it's, first of all, it's going to take a great deal of courage, right? But the way it'll change it, I think, substantially, if we commit ourselves to it, what it's going to do is going to force folks in policy to rethink what they think is winnable, right? And rethink what they think is doable, and rethink the ceilings that I see constantly in policy making. Like, people don't think, like, part of the reason why there's that divisiveness, like I'm sitting at the table with advocates and they're like, man, we can never get a bill passed that includes quote unquote violent offenders, right? Like, that's, to me, again, that's ridiculous. Like, I don't think we should be necessarily focusing on winnable and all, right? But that's my perspective. But I think if we're going to use people first language, if we're going to use the human rights frame, it's going to take a lot of courage, and it's also going to make us rethink what's possible, right? At the beginning of the webinar, Deanna said that that the Bill of Rights for criminalized workers is an aspirational document. I think it's going to force us to be a little bit more aspirational in reality, right? So not just talking about the aspirations, but actually demanding the aspirations, right? So when people are saying, well, we can never get this bill passed, it's going to take us to be like, well, where does that leave all of those people then? And be really committed to that. And last thing I'll say about this is that in Illinois, we passed the most comprehensive sealing bill ever. So that means every felony can be sealed with the exception of I believe 3 now. It went from 4, then to 9, then to everything with the exception of 4. And at the beginning of the legislative session, they told us we can never do that because the legislators are saying, well, what about the murderers and what about this or that, right? But we stood our ground, directly impacted folks, and said, no, we will not accept this. And we pushed and we passed it, So we can do that.
And yet there
Yeah,
were
and then-
still carve-outs. Go ahead, Lily.
Indeed, there were 4, and man, it's so frustrating.
Go ahead, Lily.
No, I was just going to add to that, how it's going back. I look to the abolitionist movement, right? That whole imagining the unimaginable, and also knowing like your innocence will not save you. Making the argument that one is criminal one is not going to save you, and understanding that an injury to one of us and the criminalization of one of us is really the criminalization of all of us. And imagining that, social disorders and things like that are not dealt with, crime, criminalization and punishment, and imagining a world that has a different order. So, and another thing, experience is important, but also like consciousness, right? Mm-hmm. And connectedness and all of those other things too.
Mm-hmm. And just because we're talking about imagining another order, and I'm going to get poetic for a moment, and those of you who know me know that's where I live best. But there's a famous line of a poet that I'm forgetting that says, it's less important to count clouds than it is to know the color of the sky. And to me, that's sort of the reimagining of what is possible. And I think that Deanna is still on the line, and I mentioned briefly her trip to Germany, but I hope, Deanna, that you don't mind me having you weigh in on just what that trip left you with in terms of a reimagining of a new world.
Thanks, Megan. And I want to thank the panel on highlighting the human dignity. So one of the things that totally amazed me about Germany's criminal justice system was they had rectified the harms of the concentration camps. They memorialized it, and then they created policies to make sure it never occurred again. So when you look at the United States criminal justice system built on the residual of slavery, never totally letting us free, still having titles that are tied to the same titles that were allotted to slaves. The thing in Germany that when you are incarcerated, every human is born with rights in Germany, and that's their belief. I said Germany because some of us are disadvantaged from birth when we are born in the United States. But in Germany, there's this system of everyone is born with rights, and we have no right to take your human rights. When you are incarcerated, the only right that you lose is your freedom. Every other human right that you were born with is still allotted to you, so they never have to give it to you. They never have to fight for it because they never took it away. And once your sentence is served, your freedom is then restored back to you. So in their criminal justice system, you still vote while you're incarcerated because you're a citizen. That is your right to vote. The barriers around incarceration are no longer alleviated because your sentence is served. All rights are restored to you. Again, the only one you lost was your freedom. And that whole concept had me thinking about the United States, and me and a couple of other advocates with lived experience realized in the United States as advocates, we've been asking for crumbs. Because if you start addressing it from a human perspective of everyone is a human, you no longer get allowed the argument or to run down a rabbit hole of these carve-outs of the murder because you're focusing on the humans. So it amazes me because even when we say we want to fight for criminal justice, we actually are entrenching this perpetual certain class of people. We are still isolating them. When we fight for ban the box and fair hiring, we're still isolating individuals with criminal records ourselves as advocates. And people say, but that's part of the process. And here's my analogy on that. If you take a human-centered bill to your policymakers, it almost makes them have to stand up and say, I am totally racist to this situation. You put people in an uncomfortable position.
Yes,
Now
yes.
they have to justify why, as a human, you are not deserving of this right as a human. So using people-centered language, changing the narrative. And we had this conversation with a major funder here in New York who said, how do we change the narrative? We just change it. We just start speaking it. We just start holding people accountable that when you tell me there are carve-outs for people who traffic drugs with a gun, but as a human, what right do they still have to be just sitting in a cage 30 years later when they never brandished a gun or shot someone? So we have to start, are we trying to fix a system that is working the way it was designed to work? Or are we trying to dismantle a system of structural racism that keeps entrenching and showing up? And even when the carve-outs come, I think Lily said it, even when they start carving out certain people, we're still into the, oh, you're deserving to go free, but you still got to sit on the plantation. Just because of that, we are defocusing because we haven't taken a bold stance and on this situation. And one of the things when I returned that helped me understand that was in New Orleans and Florida. So Florida passed the voting rights of 1.4 million. That was dismantling a Jim Crow law that was still entrenched in structural racism. New Orleans passed a law, I think it was Amendment 2, and it went by quietly, and I didn't hear the advocate world applaud this, but in New Orleans, they were still sentencing people they did not have to require a unanimous jury to sentence people. And there are people at Angola for 30, 40 years who were sentenced on a 9-3 jury. And that's a Jim Crow law that was entrenched that had gotten broken, and we as advocates missed it. So that was part of the structural racism as looking at our human rights. We still have those type of laws on the books. And we up here saying, can you just give us a job? So that's all I got to say.
You just said it all. No, I really appreciate that commentary from you, Deanna. And you're right. I mean, one of the things that has struck me is the capacity, whether it be mainstream media, whether it is politicians, to undermine or minimize those victories. And one of the examples of that is I remember just not hearing enough about what it meant to be having a national prison strike and the demand from inside of human rights at a moment where we were not doing that. So thank you for that. And we need to be talking in that language. We only have a couple of minutes left, so I'm gonna open it up for questions. If you have questions, please share them on the webinar chat. I think one question we've already gotten that I'm gonna slightly reframe is sort of what is going back to the notion of language. And I think every social movement in the history of the world, language has been a part of that reframing. What does that reframing need to look like now?
I think that what Deanna said was like spot on about, yeah, just start saying it and start holding people accountable. I think to certain language, like I said, like I'm in rooms, I've been guilty of it, been in rooms where all kinds of language has been used and, you know, didn't say anything. I think that's part of it because we act like, you know, nothing happened when it's said, or when these newspaper articles come out. I have a task actually within my office from a local newspaper who have been putting stories that involve people with records using the wrong language, we're going to write a letter to them, right, saying that they should probably stop doing that. So I think what Deanna said was right. We need to start using it, but also to what I said earlier, we also need to listen to people directly impacted all the time and never lose sight of that.
And just to add to that, when I first came home, I didn't know that the language that I was using was problematic. You don't know what you don't know. So I used to refer to myself as a felon, ex-felon, like I used to use that language because I didn't know any better. But once I knew better, I did better. And so I'm thankful for also those people that taught me better. So as we continue to do this work, instead of, just calling people out, but calling people in, like we say, like, hey, for me, that has what has contributed to that as well. Just to add.
I got a really interesting question, and this I'm not sure if the panel can answer, but it's something to put out to the group. Willa Paulus, sorry if I'm saying your name wrong, Willa, is enrolled in a federally recognized tribe and wants people in that nation to start using people first language, but isn't aware of whether there have been American Indian tribes who have taken on that task and not sure if anybody can answer that.
Actually, I have a couple of resources that I could share because I did read some literature on Indigenous women that were incarcerated and kind of like work around that I can share after, because I would have to search through my stuff. But I do have some info on that.
Yeah, and for folks who are on this call, we'll be sharing, after this call, you'll get information that comes out of this discussion that is both from the panelists and from some of the movements that we see as sort of leading within these fields. We are like almost at time. So I am going to first just give a pitch to our second webinar series, which will be is February 13th, 2019. So again, the second Wednesday of the month, same time, same place, same webinar link. It will be moderated by Andrea James. For those of you who do not know her, she is the almighty founder and executive director of the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls. She's a badass. And she will be accompanied by 3 other badasses: Mia Walker from Forward Justice, Doug Smith from the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition, and Fred Ordonez from Direct Action for Rights and Equality, which is called DARE. But they preceded the police program. And the only reason I could tell you who those people were and what their organizations were is because it's on my screen. But I want to thank all of the panelists today. I think this is the beginning of a conversation. We clearly have a ways to go as a movement to begin to develop the language and the tools to create systems transformation and to begin to dismantle the master's empire. So with that, thank you all, and I hope that we see you guys next month.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Thanks.
Take care. And now